They left her hanging because they believed the rope could finish what hatred had started. They thought no one would stop to look twice. They were wrong. On the edge of the New Mexico Territory in late spring of 1873, where desert dust bled into low hills and the wind never truly rested, a single choice would undo everything they were so sure of. The sun stood high and merciless, pouring heat across cracked earth and thorn-choked brush, bleaching color from the land until only endurance remained. Randy Rayner rode at an unhurried pace, eyes trained on the ground ahead, tracking the faint signs left behind by his sorrel mare, Hoof Prince, who had spooked and bolted the night before. He had followed her prints since dawn, the brittle soil barely holding her passage, the trail leading him toward a thin stand of cottonwoods crouched along a dry wash. The heat shimmered fiercely, enough to make the horizon ripple and bend, and Randy tugged his hat lower against the glare as he dismounted, looping the reins loosely over his wrist. He moved on foot now, careful and quiet, scanning the land with the steady calm of a man shaped by long solitude. Then he heard it, a sound so faint it almost vanished beneath the wind, something like a wet gasp dragged from a chest that no longer remembered how to pull air. He froze. The reins slipped from his hand. Randy eased his rifle free and stepped toward the sound, each movement measured, every sense alert. The air beneath the trees felt heavier, shadows pooling thick between the trunks. Birds had gone silent. And then he saw her. She hung from a thick, gnarled branch by her wrists, arms stretched overhead, her body slack and swaying slightly as the wind nudged her. A rough wooden sign had been nailed above her head, the letters jagged and angry, "Half-blood don't belong." Randy's breath caught hard in his chest. He stepped back once, as if the words themselves could strike him. The message wasn't meant for her alone. It was a warning carved into the world. Her skin was darkened by sun and smeared with dirt, her long black hair plastered to her face in damp strands. What remained of her dress was torn and stiff with dried blood. Her feet barely brushed the ground, legs trembling uselessly, her chest rising and falling in shallow, broken spurts. She was alive, though only just. Randy lowered his rifle. "Christ," he muttered, closing the distance. Up close he saw the burns where the rope had eaten into her wrists, raw and angry. Her lips were split, her cheeks hollowed by thirst, one eye swollen nearly shut. "You hear me?" he asked quietly. Her head lolled forward, no answer, just the faintest whimper slipping free. That was enough. Randy drew his knife, hesitating only a breath as his fingers hovered near the rope. The sign creaked above them, swinging slightly in the wind. "Not today," he whispered, and with a single clean cut the rope gave way. She fell forward, and Randy caught her, her weight startlingly light, fever-hot against his chest. For a moment her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, lips moving soundlessly, then her fingers curled weakly into his shirt and her body went limp. He crouched, cradling her with one arm while fumbling for his canteen, dribbling a few drops onto a cloth and touching it to her mouth. "Easy," he murmured. "You're safe. For now." The branches rustled overhead. Randy looked once more at the sign, then lifted her fully into his arms and turned away from the tree, from the warning, from the curse they had tried to hang her with. She weighed no more than a bundle of grain. "Got a name?" he asked softly, already knowing there would be no answer. "We'll find one." His boots crunched over dry leaves as he carried her back toward his horse, leaving the sign swinging uselessly in the wind. By evening he reached his ranch, a modest cabin and barn tucked into a shallow ravine miles from any settlement, the land stretching empty and unforgiving in every direction. Naomi lay slumped in the saddle, unconscious but breathing. Randy dismounted and lifted her down with care, carrying her inside as the sun dipped low. The cabin was cool and smelled of cedar and dust. He laid her on the cot by the window and covered her with a clean wool blanket. She stirred faintly, brow tightening. "Easy," he whispered, lighting the oil lamp. He fetched water, warmed it, and knelt beside her, cleaning the blood and sweat from her face with slow, gentle strokes. He saved her wrists for last, pausing at the deep grooves left by the rope, then wrapped them carefully in linen, tying each knot loose but firm. Hours slipped by. Wind rattled the shutters, but inside the cabin the world was still. Near midnight she woke with a gasp, eyes wild, clawing at the blanket as panic surged through her. Randy rose but kept his distance. "You're safe," he said softly. "I'm not them." She stared at him, breathing ragged, saying nothing. He poured water into a cup and set it within her reach, then sat back in the corner, silent. Eventually she drank, hands shaking, and something in her eased just enough. She lay back down, exhaustion pulling her under. Randy watched her sleep, whispering into the dark, "You're safe here." And for the first time since she'd been cut down from the tree, she didn't try to run. The days that followed settled into a strange, careful rhythm, the kind born not of comfort but of watchfulness. The wind swept dry and sharp across the Rayner ranch, dragging sand into restless curls that skittered along the hard-packed earth and whispered against the cabin walls. More than a week had passed since Randy brought her back, and the silence between them had shifted from raw fear into something steadier, like a quiet agreement neither had spoken aloud. She did not ask questions. He did not press her for answers. They moved around each other with measured respect, sharing space the way wounded animals sometimes do, aware that sudden movements could shatter what little trust had taken root. But beneath that fragile calm, Randy felt an unease he could not fully name. It tugged at him in the early morning light when he stepped outside and saw footprints near the barn, too narrow and too fresh to be his, curving toward the well before vanishing into firmer ground. Someone had been close, close enough to watch. He erased the tracks with his boot and said nothing. From that morning on, he slept with his rifle across his lap and checked the door twice each night before the lantern was blown out. He scanned the horizon before turning the horses loose, lingered on the porch long after sunset, the lantern at his feet casting restless shadows across his boots. Inside, Naomi stayed near the window, wrapped in one of his old coats, her gaze following the land as if it might lunge at her if she looked away. Then one evening, as the sun bled red across the dirt and the heat finally loosened its grip, she pushed the door open and stepped outside barefoot. Randy looked up sharply from where he sat whittling a piece of driftwood, but he didn't speak. He watched as she crossed the yard slowly, her steps light and cautious, as though she were relearning how to trust the ground. In her hand she carried a slender stick. She knelt near the barn and began to draw in the dust. Randy rose and approached carefully, stopping a few paces behind her. She didn't flinch. Curving lines took shape beneath her hand, wings arcing, a body flaring outward as if wrapped in flame. "What's that?" he asked quietly. She didn't look up. "My family's sign," she said, her voice rough but steady. "The Firebird." He crouched beside her, studying the image. She went on, words coming slowly, each one scraped raw. Her mother had painted it on their tent poles. They believed it was a spirit of protection, fierce but never cruel, one that flew through fire so others could survive. Her voice faltered. She had been meant to die with them. They had been accused of killing a white rancher's wife, though it was the husband who had beaten her. Everyone knew it, but blame had found an easier target. Soldiers had come first, then townsfolk, bringing fire and rope. She spoke of brothers shot down, of a mother who screamed until the flames took her, of being tied beneath a tree like a warning carved into flesh. She did not cry as she spoke, only stared at the burning bird she had drawn. Randy said nothing. He did not reach for her. Instead he lowered his hand and pressed his palm into the dirt beside the image, fingers spread, grounding himself there with her grief. She noticed. When she looked at him, her eyes were wet but steady. It wasn't comfort he offered. It was acknowledgement. And for the first time since he had cut her down, she let herself cry, not from fear, but because someone had stayed. The air felt wrong the morning the soldiers came, heavy and waiting. Randy saw the dust plume first, rising along the far ridge like smoke from a distant fire. He stood at the fence line, jaw tight beneath his hat brim. Brass glinted in the sun, the cadence of hooves unmistakable. Naomi watched from the cabin doorway, half hidden in shadow. 3 men rode up. One dismounted, boots too polished for the land, silver badge catching the light. He introduced himself cleanly, efficiently, as Lieutenant Garrett James. Randy nodded and took the folded paper offered to him. The sketch was crude but unmistakable. Dark hair. Sharp cheekbones. Fire even in ink. Naomi's name printed below, wanted for murder and escape. Garrett spoke of duty, of service to the country, of danger. Randy listened, then folded the paper and handed it back. "Ain't seen anyone like that," he said evenly. The lieutenant's gaze slid past him toward the cabin. "Mind if we look around?" "I do." The tension hung sharp between them, like drawn steel. At last Garrett smiled thinly and mounted up, promising they'd be nearby. Randy watched them disappear before turning back inside. Naomi sat rigid at the table. She had heard everything. "Why did you lie for me?" she asked. Randy took his time answering. "Because I see you," he said, "and I don't see a killer." That night they sat by the fire in silence. Until Naomi moved, reached out, and pressed her hand first to her own chest, then to his. Randy covered her hand with his, understanding passing between them without words. The next threat came with less ceremony. 5 men rode in at dusk, led by Joe Cormarmac, a man whose smile had always been sharper than his morals. He accused, threatened, demanded. Randy refused. When violence came, it came fast. He didn't draw his gun. He moved like water, using their weight against them, breaking the fight before it could become a killing. 1 man fled at his command. The others dragged Joe away, bloodied and cursing. Naomi watched from the doorway, breath held, then stepped into the fading light and spoke his name. Randy. 1 word, carrying gratitude, fear, and something fragile and bright. He answered simply, "I'm here." She pressed her forehead to his chest, and he held her, not to claim, but to steady. That night, beneath the lantern's glow, Naomi told him her true name. Scion. Bringer of life. She told him of firebirds painted on bark, of her mother's last command to carry truth, not hatred. Then she asked the question she had carried like a blade. If she had not been half white, if she had not carried his blood too, would he still have cut her down? Randy touched her cheek gently. "I don't love your blood," he said. "I love the fight inside it." She leaned forward then, their lips meeting in a kiss that released more than it took, and when they parted, the weight they had both borne alone finally eased. The following day dawned clear and deceptive, the kind of morning that looked like mercy but carried no promises. The sun crept up over the ridgeline, painting the land in pale gold, while the quiet pressed close around the ranch as if listening. Randy felt it before he saw it, that tightening in the chest that came from knowing a reckoning was already moving toward you. He stood at the fence with his spyglass, scanning the far hills, and when the glint of blue cloth and brass caught the light, he didn't curse or shout. He simply lowered the glass and breathed out slow. Inside the cabin, Scion stood at the window, arms folded tight across her middle. She didn't ask what he'd seen. She already knew. When he stepped inside, hat in hand, his expression told her everything. "They're riding hard," he said. "Cavalry. A day out, maybe less." She nodded once. "You stayed anyway." He moved closer, close enough that the air between them felt charged. "I stayed because this is worth more than the dirt they want to bury you in." For a long moment she said nothing, fingers twisting into the fabric of her blouse. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "I know." His voice was steady, already shaped by decision. "Which is why we can't stay." Her eyes lifted. "Run." He shook his head. "Not run. Ride. South. Somewhere their laws don't reach. Somewhere no one knows your name." He paused, then added, I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to live with me. Her breath caught. She wasn't afraid anymore, not of the soldiers, not of the men who hunted her, but of the weight of choosing something that felt like hope. I'll go, she said at last. Not to escape. To live. That night they prepared without ceremony. Randy packed light, spoke low to the horses as he saddled them, movements calm and practiced. Sion braided her hair tight and tied a red thread at her throat, a remnant of her mother's shawl. They left before the moon rose, the cabin door swinging shut behind them, no fire left burning, no goodbye spoken aloud. The land swallowed their tracks quickly, the night wide and quiet, stars blinking like old witnesses. They rode side by side, not fugitives or heroes, just two people carrying everything they had left in the space between heartbeats. At the edge of the valley, Sion looked back once. I'll remember the sound of the wind here, she said. Randy nodded. I'll remember the first time you said my name. They rode on, trust no longer a question but the only thing they carried. The moon climbed high, pale and bone-bright, silvering the scrub and stone as they neared the border. Freedom lay only miles ahead, unseen but close enough to taste. Randy's focus stayed sharp, eyes sweeping the trail, body taut in the saddle. Sion rode beside him, the red thread fluttering softly at her throat. Then the night shattered. A rifle cracked, sharp and merciless. Randy jerked, blood blooming across his shirt like a sudden star. He slumped from the saddle, hitting the ground hard. Randy! Sion screamed, reins tearing through her hands as she leapt down. Another shot hissed past. She dragged him toward a narrow wash carved into the rock, hauling him inch by inch as bullets snapped into stone. Blood soaked through his fingers as he pressed them to his side. He looked up at her, eyes glassy but fierce. You were tied to a tree once, he rasped. I won't leave you. Not now. She pressed both hands to his wound, forcing the bleeding to slow. Then don't die, she said, her voice steady as iron. She grabbed his rifle, checked the chamber, and peered through the rocks. Two cavalrymen advanced, careless in their confidence. She waited, breath held, then fired. One went down screaming. She fired again, wide, selling the lie that more waited with her. Silence stretched thin, then hoofbeats retreated. Only when the sound faded did she turn back to Randy. Stay with me, she whispered, kissing his forehead. We're almost there. Dawn found them across the border, alive. Weeks passed in a hidden clearing by a river bend, pine and water sheltering them from maps and patrols. Randy healed slowly, walking with a limp, but he lived. He trained horses again, never letting Sion out of his sight for long. In a small house built of patience and pine, she sat by the window stitching a tiny shirt, her belly rounded beneath her apron. Outside, Randy spoke softly to a young Mustang, his gaze always finding her silhouette. The past had not vanished, but it no longer hunted them. She folded the small garment and held it to her chest, smiling. The wind moved softer here, whispering through pine needles instead of scraping across stone, as if the land itself had learned how to be gentle. The cabin they built sat near a slow bend in the river, its walls rough-hewn and uneven, every beam placed by hand, every flaw earned. It wasn't much, but it held. Randy moved slower now, the old wound reminding him of itself when the air turned cold, but he worked without complaint, hands steady, eyes sharp. Each morning he rose before the sun, checking the horses, testing the perimeter out of habit more than fear. Each evening he returned to the sight of Sion at the window, her presence grounding him in a way nothing else ever had. Time passed differently here. Days stretched long and quiet, measured not by danger but by small rituals. Sion learned the curve of the river, the way the light shifted through the trees, the places where wildflowers pushed stubbornly through the undergrowth. She carried her past with her, but it no longer sat like a blade at her throat. At night, when the fire burned low, she spoke sometimes of her mother, of stories told beneath stars, of firebirds painted on bark. Randy listened without interrupting, without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. He stayed. That was the difference. One evening, as the sky faded into bruised purple and gold, Sion sat at the table, needle flashing in the lamplight as she stitched the last seam of the tiny shirt. Her hands had grown sure again, movements slow and careful. She held the finished piece up, studying it as if it were something fragile and sacred. Randy watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame, the scent of pine and smoke clinging to him. "You did good," he said quietly. She smiled, small and real. "So did you." Later that night, when the stars burned bright and the river murmured low, she placed the shirt in a wooden chest at the foot of the bed, resting her palm over it for a long moment. Randy came to stand behind her, his hands settling gently at her waist. They stood like that in silence, breathing in sync, the future no longer something to outrun. The memory of the tree never fully left her. Some nights she still woke with the echo of rope and heat and shouting lodged in her chest. But when she reached out, Randy was there, solid and real, his presence cutting through the past like dawn through fog. He never asked her to forget. He never told her she was safe now as if it were a promise that erased what had been. He simply stayed awake with her until the shaking passed, until the night loosened its grip. And in those moments, something inside her healed that she had once believed was beyond repair. Years later, travelers would sometimes pass near the river, catching sight of smoke curling from the chimney, hearing the low sound of a man's voice carried on the wind, steady and calm. Some would speak of a woman with dark hair and eyes like firelight, her gaze sharp but kind, her presence unyielding. No one ever stayed long. The land discouraged idle curiosity, and Randy made it clear without words that this place was not for taking. It was for keeping. On a clear morning heavy with birdsong, Sion stood barefoot in the grass, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other shading her eyes as she watched Randy work the corral. He caught her looking and tipped his hat, a smile breaking through the lines of his face. In that moment, the world felt wide and possible, not because it had ever been kind, but because they had chosen each other anyway. Voiceover, they tried to erase her for being born between worlds, but he saw what the rope couldn't kill. He didn't save her to make her smaller, quieter, or easier to explain. He loved her whole, for what she endured and what she refused to become. In a land shaped by judgment and fire, they carved out something stronger than fear. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that even on the harshest frontier, love can still choose defiance over cruelty, then you've found your place. Here, we tell stories where quiet hearts face loud violence, where tenderness survives the dust. Stay with us. Subscribe, and ride along for more tales from the edge of the world, where loyalty still matters and love refuses to die.